Hello everyone and welcome back. In today's video we are going to be going over chapter 3. And so let me go ahead and put up our PowerPoint for today. And so we're going to be doing chapter 3. Okay, and here it is. So let me go to chapter 3 first. All right, so chapter 3, Interpersonal Communication and the Self. And so in today's lesson, we are going to be talking about identity, self-concept, self-esteem, reflected appraisal, social comparison, perceived self and presenting self, and then Erving Goffman's space theory. We are also going to be talking about self-disclosure and the social penetration theory. If this lesson or this video is too long, I'll probably push those two into separate videos just because this is a very, very lengthy chapter. So hopefully I can reduce the material quite a bit, but it is a lot of information. I do recommend that you read this chapter. It's so important that you are reading these lessons, but this chapter is amazing. It will definitely make you think a little bit more about who you believe yourself to be and maybe why you are the way that you are. It's going to help you kind of reflect on who you are as a person a bit more, and that's going to help you for your upcoming paper. So last week, our last mini activity was this, right? And so I had you discuss like who are you a bit, and also I had you make a list 1 through 10 with statements that began with I am, and then you went through and you put yours. This is what mine looks like. As you can see, I am hardworking, I'm an educator. So you each went through and you did that, and then I had you go through, rank order them. Some of you had done that from the very beginning, so you ranked order them, and then you categorize them. I don't think I had you categorize them, but something that I would like for you to do is think about how these categories, like how would these categories exist? And this is kind of how it was for me. There's different personality traits, career. As you can see, for the first main thing, it was a group affiliation for me. So being a daughter, being sister, those were the two at the top of my priority for who I believe myself to be. And so for myself, I would not be who I am without my mother and my father. And so if I were writing this paper, I would specifically look at them and their contributions to the makeup of me and how they influenced my being, how they influenced my beliefs, but also how other social factors did as well. But here's my list, just kind of for funsies. I know that you all did this for last week in preparation for this week. And so let's go ahead and jump right into this chapter because it relates all back to you as an individual and where these attributes, where these characteristics, where they came from. And so let's first jump into identity. What even is identity? So our identity is the trait and characteristics, social relations, roles, and social group memberships that define who one is. So who are you as a person? We all went through, we made our little identity collages, our identity presentation, and you're not wrong in stating who you are. This is my identity. These are the things that matter the most to me. These are the people who matter the most to me. These are certain characteristics and traits that make up who I am. So that's what identity is. We did a whole presentation last week all on it. And so moving on, we also have our self-concept. So our self-concept is specifically the set of perceptions you hold onto yourself. And now that can include your emotional state, your talents, your likes, your dislikes, your values, different roles that you have. So for your self-concept specifically, it's looking at the perceptions you hold of yourself. So who do you believe yourself to be? That's more so closely tied with your self-concept. Do people use identity and self-concept interchangeably? I would say I have seen people use them interchangeably, but for your self-concept paper, you are specifically digging deep into your own perceptions of who you think that you are and where they came from, where these ideas stem from. So that's what self-concept is. It's the set of perceptions you hold onto yourself. Moving on, we have the developing of our self-concept. So where does this even come from? So it begins around the age of 6 to 7 months when we are just infants, barely figuring out life around us, right? And then this is when babies start to have more understanding of their movements, and they realize like these are my hands, and they start being a little bit more fascinated with themselves. And now moving on, it is also related to the evolution of self-concept comes from social interactions that we have. And so for some, this might be a little bit of a debate. I mean, it depends on what discipline you do come from, but in regards to communication, the evolution of self-concept comes from our social interactions that we have growing up. So we're like little sponges, and I'm sure you've heard that before. You've heard us talk about like kids, and they absorb everything around them. And that is, in a sense, true. There are definitely factors that, interactional factors that come into play into what we deem as appropriate versus inappropriate, what we deem as important versus non-important. And so they definitely do play a role in how we also communicate with other people around us. But our self-concept, essentially, it evolves from those interactions that we do have. And so for myself, for instance, a lot of people say that I'm very similar to my mom, and I would say I very much so am. Do we have different beliefs? Is she her own person? Am I my own person? Yeah, of course. But I grew up very close to my mother. I spent so much time with my mother. Even now today, I spend so much time with her. And I'm very proud to say that, you know, we do have an overlap of similarities and traits and interests, but we are very much so unique in our own way. But I would not be who I am. My perception of myself and my self-concept would not be what it is without that interaction with her growing up. And so think about interactions that you have had and that you weren't able to have growing up, and how those affected you as a person. That's something that you want to look at for your self-concept paper. Moving on, we have characteristics associated with our self-concept. And so first and foremost, it's more so subjective, right? It's based off of you and your beliefs. What you believe might not necessarily be what somebody else believes about you, about who you are as a person, right? Next, we have that it's more so flexible, but it also resists change. And so this is kind of interesting when we talk about our self-concept. Think about yourself 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 5 years ago. Would you consider yourself to be the same person that you were all that time ago, even a year ago? Some of you would say most definitely not. I look back at myself 10 years ago, most certainly not. I've changed quite a bit. But, and see, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about flexibility. Can changes be made over time based off of our experiences? Of course it can. It is flexible in that sense. But it also does tend to resist change. And like, have you ever met someone who really sees the best in people, and they're like, you know what, I can help them, I can help them change. You know, they're trying their best, and whether it's like with children or another adult, they're like, you know, they're just, and so there may be certain characteristics about ourselves that do resist that change. And some people will say, well, we are who we are by a certain age. There's just certain things that we can't change about ourselves. And then there's those individuals that are at the other end who might say, no, it's like, it's flexible, we can change, but we have to want to make the effort to change. And so again, that statement in itself is very subjective of whether or not you believe that to be true. But characteristics of our self-concept, one, it is more so subjective. It's based off of your perception. Perceptions are very different. Two, it is flexible. Can it change over time? Of course, we're not always the same individuals. We're not always stagnant in that sense. But does it resist change? Yeah, it most certainly does. Next, let's dig a little bit into cognitive conservatism, and it's the tendency to seek confirmation of existing self-concepts. And so when I'm doing my work, for instance, because right now I am living with my parents and I'm going to be moving next week because I've been saving, and so I know I'm excited, y'all. I'm excited. But I saw everybody who's like, who just recently moved into a home. I'm excited for you all. It's such a great, it's an amazing accomplishment. But I love spending time with my parents and seeing them frequently. I really appreciate the time. But in saying that, going back to cognitive conservatism, it's the tendency to seek confirmation of existing self-concept. So my mother, she'll see me working, she'll see me putting together my lesson plans, and it's a lot of the behind the scenes that people don't see, right? People don't see us stressing, people don't really see us struggling. They see us show up to the exam, take the exam, and then go home. And so that's the behind the scenes. And my mother, she'll see me behind the scenes, and sometimes I'll say things to her and be like, oh, like, look at my lesson plan, and look at this. And in a sense, I am kind of seeking that confirmation from her of that self-concept that, oh, I'm a good instructor. I try my best and I want to be the best version of myself possible. And so in doing these things and showing her these things, I'm hopeful that she does see that as well, because I want her to confirm that self-concept that I have of myself, that perception that I have of myself. And a lot of the time we do that, maybe unknowingly, maybe we didn't know that there's a word for it, but we do tend to seek confirming messages of that existing self-concept that we do have on ourselves. Like, we want people to believe that we are the way that we believe that we are, if that makes sense. So let's go ahead and move on and talk about how our self-esteem affects our self-concept. So our self-esteem is an evaluation of our self-worth, and this contributes to how you communicate with other people and your views. So growing up, did you always have a high self-esteem or a low self-esteem? And that's something that I really want you to think about. Have you always had a high self-esteem? You were always very confident with your abilities, and that's not a bad thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but where do you think that stemmed from? Was it your parents telling you, yes, like, you need to stay confident, you're going to do great things, and you had that mentality of like, yes, I'm going to stay confident, I'm a good person, and so on and so forth? Or did you have moments where there was a lot of self-doubt, where maybe you didn't think highly of yourself, and why? Where do you think that stemmed from? Again, this is something that you may want to address within your self-concept. And how did that affect who you are today? And how is your self-esteem today? And so I like to think about self-esteem as like kind of like a roller coaster. Sometimes it has ups, sometimes it has downs. Some individuals, they have very high self-esteem. And again, why? And that's something I've had students write about, having a high self-esteem for the majority of their life and who contributed to that. So think about your self-esteem, whether it is high, whether it is low, how it's been in the past, how it's been more recently, and why. What factors influence your self-esteem? Why do you feel that way about yourself? And so, have I always had a high self-esteem? No. I think back to barely starting at RCC, and no, I definitely did not have a high self-esteem for quite some time. I remember telling you all that I was always the quiet student in class. I never participated. I just thought that my voice didn't have any type of value or any type of meaning within a classroom dynamic, and that's not what I want. I never want students to feel that way, and that's kind of why I decided to teach, is to make students, or to hopefully make students feel like, hey, like my voice is valued, and I can speak my opinion, and maybe I don't say things always in the right way, but I'm only human, and you all are only human, right? And that's what I want students to think, is like, I'm human, like I can make mistakes, I can accidentally say things, and try to fix them in a sense. And that's kind of, go back to your self-esteem, think about, do you have high self-esteem, do you have low self-esteem, what contributed to that? And I know many of us have had moments of lower self-esteem, and it could have been due to relationships that we've had, external factors, friends, family members, so on and so forth. So think about your self-esteem, think about how you feel about yourself and where that came from. Moving on, we have reflective appraisal. So this kind of goes back to other individuals and their judgments. So reflective appraisal is mirroring of others' judgments, and that kind of goes back to this cognitive conservatism. It makes sense, it ties in with that. But reflective appraisal, you're mirroring, in a sense, others' judgments. And so if my mom tells me, you are such a strong, confident woman, I am going to want to mirror, in a sense, that perception of me. Like, you know what? And it is a positive perception, in my opinion. Like, okay, that is a positive perception of me. I want her to continue to think that of me, so I'm going to behave and act in that manner as well, and demonstrate that through my actions. And so we tend to mirror that of others' judgments, and typically we want to mirror those judgments of the people who are most valuable to us, who are closest to us. And that could be our significant other, even our parents, but our significant others do tend to have a higher impact on us. And so there are very influential relationships that tend to play a huge role in how we perceive ourselves and how we want to mirror those judgments that our partners or our family members have on us. And so moving on, we have social comparison. You see how these all kind of like align with who we believe ourselves to be, but also relationships, and also our paper. This all has to do with our paper. Like, you can use any of these concepts for your paper. And so with social comparison, we are evaluating ourselves in comparison with others. And then before we jump into reference groups, because it ties into this example, think about growing up and having negative experiences when it came to evaluating yourself with others. And so growing up, I've always, been, to be completely honest, like a little bit bigger. I grew up and I remember I had kids tease me because of my weight. And that definitely did influence my self-esteem greatly. And I would always compare myself in regards to how big or how small. Even when I was an athlete, when I played sports, I would always compare myself, my weight to other people, and that's not healthy by any means. That's not to say that that is healthy to do it. That wasn't healthy for me at that time. That definitely did contribute to my low self-esteem, but also I would compare my abilities. And I would be like, oh my goodness, that person's so much better than me. Look at, they're getting A's on their exams, they're doing this, they're doing that. And see how it can be a negative thing and how it can negatively affect your self-esteem. But it can also be a positive thing when you are evaluating yourself in comparison to others. It can motivate you to want to do better as well. And it is kind of like a frame of mind, and it's not the same for every single person. Because there have been instances where, let's say, I was on a tennis team, and I would notice this individual, she would practice every single day, she would put a lot of hard work into it, and she started getting better than me at the game. And I noticed that, and I was like, oh no, I need to practice more. I need to try my best to beat her, but I need to try my best to do better and be the best version of myself in regards to being a player on this team. And so was I evaluating myself with them? Yes. Was it necessarily a bad thing? No, in the sense that I noticed that, hey, this person's doing well. I wasn't upset at them for doing well, but I was thinking to myself, okay, I want to do better. They're doing better, I want to do better too. So it can also be a positive thing, which is important to mention. I know a lot of the time when we think about comparing ourselves to other people, we do think we have a negative mindset of that. I know I have, but it can also be a positive thing. It can make you want to do better. It can make you strive for better things. And so with that, we have reference groups. And those are others against who we evaluate our own characteristics. So the example that I gave was the other tennis player. But we can also see this on social media, especially nowadays, right? Like many of us have our phones with us, and we might be on Instagram, Facebook, Tumblr, YouTube, whatever you might be on. And so maybe it's not true for you, but there are individuals that I specifically do know that might compare themselves to other individuals. Like, for instance, my niece, she's starting to get into the social media realm. And so I have to remind her, like, you know what, like, there's editing apps, there's this, there's that. Remember that people are editing their pictures and so on and so forth. Like this, you're perfect the way that you are. Like this, we are normal. Like, it's fine, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with the way that we are. And so we do have those reference groups, though, whether it is now online on digital media, that's something that we have to be careful of with our children too. And then friends or families. And again, it can be a positive thing. You might see someone on social media very successful and you're like, you know what, I aspire to be like that. I'm going to keep working hard so I can get there too. So again, it can be a positive, can be a negative thing, but we have these reference groups, whoever they might be. And so moving on, we have our perceived and our presenting selves. This kind of goes back to, or this is going to kind of tie into Erving Goffman's space theory. But let's first focus on our perceived self versus our presenting self. So our perceived self is the person you believe yourself to be in moments of honest self-examination. So these are moments where you're kind of just sitting in your room and you're self-reflecting. You're really analyzing, who am I as a person? And it's not just that, oh, I'm a good person and I like dogs and I like that's very surface level, right? When we're talking about our perceived self, you're really honestly looking at who you are as a person, changes that you want to make, positive attributes about yourself. And usually this is private. This is your private self that not a lot of people really get to see. This is who you believe yourself to be. This is the private self. In moments of real self-examination, this is who you believe yourself to be, and it's private. Your presenting self is the way that you want to appear to other people. This is the public. And so how I present myself to my students, it's not necessarily the same way that I present myself in an interview. It's not necessarily the same way that I present myself to my friends. It's not the same way that I present myself even to my parents. And so that actually ties into Erving Goffman's space theory. And so Erving Goffman's space theory, it contends that we are all actors actors on a stage. We have that perceived self, right? And then we have that presenting self. So when you're at home and no one's around, you might do some strange things, like talk to yourself, right? Like that self-talk, or you might just be comfortable wearing your like comfy clothes. I know I do that. I wear my leggings at home, I wear my t-shirts at home, but then when I go out in public, typically I will get ready, like for work specifically, I'll get ready for work and I'll put on my teacher clothes and I'll put on my makeup and I'll try to do my hair a little bit, pull my hair back. And so this is a face of mine. So face, your socially approved identity. This is my teacher face. This is my instructor face. Am I always like this? No, I'm not always like this. I'm not always upbeat. I'm not always excited. I'm not always, no. I have a tamer side to me, but that's one of my many faces that I have. I have another face. I have my student face. I have my sister face. I have my daughter face. And so I personally do not always act the same in every single context with every single individual. These are the different faces that I have. It's kind of like different caps that you wear. I am a student, I am a teacher, I am a daughter, and so on. And I am a coworker, and so on and so forth. Then you also have face work. So these are the verbal and nonverbal ways in which we act to maintain our own presenting image and the images of others. So it's like actors on a stage again, where you are in a sense complimenting the way that other people are behaving as well. And so you're working together with these other individuals in maintaining that face. So when I teach, students sit in the class and you all are contributing to me being able to contain that face. If you all weren't sitting in the class, sitting like watching these videos, right, there'd be all chaos. We wouldn't know what to like there, but you all know like, okay, I need to watch these videos, I need to sit in the class, I need to do this, and so on and so forth. And so you all are contributing to it. So with face work, verbal, nonverbal ways in which we attain to maintain our presenting self, again, that can be our appearance, that could be our facial expressions, that could be the way that we physically present ourselves, walking into a classroom, starting my video, and those nonverbal, these hand gestures, how I know students' names, and so on and so forth. And so it goes back and forth. Next, we have our front stage and our back stage, and this is something that I was somewhat referring to previously. So this is our stage. Going out in public, the minute that you wake up and you start doing things, maybe you're talking with your parents and you go out to the store, you go to school, that's our front stage. This is what we show the world around us. And then our backstage is where all of that preparation takes place. Like again, students don't see me prepare things. Students don't see me stress. They don't see me struggle. They don't see my family environment. They don't know, like, you know what I mean? Like, people don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And the same with all of you. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. Maybe you do feel comfortable disclosing certain information, but for the most part, our backstage, it's like where we prepare, where we get ready, where nobody really gets to see. It's more so private. Whereas our front stage, we're playing a role and, oh, hey everyone. Like, if you see me around campus, I just, hi everyone, how you doing? What's up? What's going on? And then when I see my mom, I'm like, hey, what's up? How's it going? What'd you do today? So, and you can tell in the way, in my tone, in my movements, right? So there's the front stage, there's the back stage, and then you have all of these different faces. So what faces do you wear? What faces are you wearing when you are out in public, when you are interacting with different individuals, such as your partner or your family members or your siblings? Are you constantly wearing the same face, or are you adjusting based off of the different contexts? So there's that, Erving Goffman's face theory. It's a fun theory, isn't it? Like thinking about yourself as an actor on a stage. Moving on, we have the self-fulfilling prophecy. And so with the self-fulfilling prophecy, we have a circular stage. And so first, there is holding an expectation for yourself or for others. Second, we have behaving in accordance with that expectation. Then third, the expectation comes to pass, and then we reinforce the original expectation. So in summary, that would be like you having some sort of expectation of yourself. So the self-fulfilling prophecy is like you saying, I'm going to do really bad on this exam, right? So that's an expectation that you have on yourself. I'm going to do really bad on this exam, and then you're just like, you know what, I haven't been doing any of the readings, I haven't really been doing I haven't really been watching the videos, and you're behaving in that accordance with that expectation, right? It's there. And so you take the exam, and so you're doing it, and you know that you're not doing well on it. You're like, this is what's happening. The expectation comes to pass, and then you end up getting a poor grade on it, and there you go. You're reinforcing that original expectation that you had. And so the way that we think holds a very high place in regards to our behavior. So if, for instance, I think this video is gonna suck, I'm not going to be able to express myself, right? And so self-talk is very important when it comes to your being and how you feel about yourself. Self-talk. So are you speaking positively to yourself, or are you speaking negatively to yourself? Are you telling yourself, wow, you're not doing well, you're horrible at making videos, you're not doing any of the readings, what are you doing, Cecilia? No. If you continue to reinforce positive self-talk, it's going to make you think positively of yourself as well. So, for instance, this video is gonna come out wonderful. I'm very excited about it, right? And I hold that expectation. I try to hold a positive expectation for all of my students and always for myself as well. Because if I go into a situation thinking, this is going to be bad, this is going to be negative, more than likely it will be bad, more than likely it will be negative. If I say, hey, my students are going to be very successful in this class, right? And that's probably the expectation you all want me to have, because then, right? Because most of the time, 99% of the time, it does come to pass, and it is a positive experience, and I enjoy all of you, and I enjoy getting to know all of you. And so remember, self-talk, it really does play a really big influence in the self-fulfilling prophecy. So what you believe will or will not come to pass, in a sense. And next we have the two types of self-fulfilling prophecy. So there's the self-imposed, so those are expectations you have on yourself. And then there's other imposed prophecies, where other individuals play a role in the prophecies that you, again, hold onto yourself. And so if, for instance, you have an individual growing up the majority of your life who says, you're not going to go to higher education, you're not going to do that, like that's not something that we do, you're not bright enough to do that. There are individuals, unfortunately, where those other imposed prophecies do come to pass. And then there are other times where people are told that, and they're like, no, you know, you might have that expectation of me, but it's not going to come to pass. I'm going to do well for myself regardless of your expectations of me. And so you can see how it's not always the case. There may be an exam, for instance, where you don't think that you're going to do well on it, and then you end up doing wonderful because you did put your time in, you did study for it. And so there kind of is like that gray area, but there's the self-imposed prophecy, what you hold upon yourself, expectations you hold on yourself, and then there's other imposed prophecies. So think about other imposed prophecies and how those have contributed to your self-esteem and your beliefs on yourself as well. Next, we have impression management. And see, like there's an overlap between all of these. So impression management, the communication strategies people use to influence how others view them. Think about this, for instance, online. What are some communication strategies people will use to influence how people view them online? And so could it be the pictures that they put online? How are they managing their impression to you when they post only positive pictures of themselves? If they only post positive pictures or pictures of them going out, doing great things, right? You might have the impression of them then that, wow, they're living their best lives, they're doing great things for themselves, they must be very successful, when in reality, behind the screen, they may be going through a lot of hardship, and that's just not something that they want to demonstrate, and they instead want to influence how other people view them more so in a positive light rather than in like the realities of their life. And so when it comes to impression management, there are different characteristics associated with it. So one, it's a construction of multiple identities, and that goes back to saying that we are not the same person with every single individual that we meet. Even with your friends, you might feel more comfortable talking with one friend versus talking with another friend, or sharing some experiences with one friend versus another friend. And some individuals might think of this as being fake. You might hear that a lot, like, oh, they're so fake, they always act like this with this person, and they're never like that with me. And it could just be that they have a different identity with that individual versus with you. And that may not always be the case. Maybe they tell you, yeah, I hate this individual, and then they're over there like, hey, how you doing, girl? So who knows, right? But we do have different identities. We do construct multiple identities, so you may not be the same with that individual that that person is with them as well. Then it's collaborative. Remember, it goes back and forth. Other people play a role in how we go about managing our impressions as well as managing our identity. And then impression management can be deliberate or unconscious. I think a lot of the time it is unconscious. I remember before taking this class, I would just I would do these things without really acknowledging why I was doing these things. So for an interview, for instance, how are you managing your impression or impression management within an interview dynamic? How are you managing your identity? How do you want them to perceive you, and what are you doing non-verbally, verbally to feel comfortable within that dynamic, but also feel accepted maybe in that type of dynamic? So think about that. How are you managing your impressions, and are you always conscious of it, or is it more so of an unconscious kind of thing? So hopefully now, knowing what it is, maybe you're going to be hopefully more conscious about it. Next, let's talk about face-to-face impression management. So we're going to kind of briefly go over this. So there's manner, appearance, setting. We've kind of already discussed each one of these. So going back to like the way that you present yourself in an interview, maybe you get a little bit more dressed up. You're dressed like you're playing the character now. Going back to face theory, you're playing the role. Okay, I'm a teacher, let me put on my teacher clothes and let me go to this interview. Let me seem like I'm extremely enthusiastic when in reality, like I've had a rough day. So how are you changing and adjusting to the dynamic and changing your appearance for that specific context? What is your manner of speaking? What is your manner of delivery? What is your manner of nonverbal communication? And then, of course, also setting, looking at the context of the situation. You might come into a specific dynamic a certain way and then make adjustments, kind of figuring out like, okay, that wasn't necessarily acceptable, or, oh, okay, I can be a little bit more enthusiastic. These people are really kind and nice and don't seem so judgmental. So then there's that. Moving on, let's talk about impression management and honesty. We already talked about this a bit. So deception on social media, whether you're being fake versus not fake, or doing an impression management. We already talked about this, but it's important to note that some individuals, they're just not the same in different contexts with different people. In one interview, you might be super peppy because it might be related to interacting with individuals and being open with individuals, whereas in another context, maybe you are doing an interview for, I'm trying to think something that's a little bit more tame. Maybe an Amazon picker, right? The package picker. And I remember talking to a student, or messaging a student. I had actually applied for Amazon and I was going to do that job, and they didn't really have interviews for that job. But if I were to go in that setting, I probably wouldn't focus more so on like, hi everyone, so today we are going to talk about, no, I would definitely adjust based off of the context, based off of the interviewer, kind of how they greeted me, and so on and so forth. So remember, it's not necessarily being fake. For some of you, you might think, okay, yeah, some certain people are being fake, but in other instances, they're just managing their impression because they're going with the context of the situation, or they may feel a certain way about certain individuals as well. Moving on, let's go to self-disclosure. So I'm going to just go ahead and continue on. I was probably going to put these into 3 different videos, but let me just put it all in one. Y'all can come back to this if you want to come back to this. But let's go ahead and move on to self-disclosure. So self-disclosure is the process of deliberately revealing information about oneself that is significant and that would not normally be known by others. So what do you feel comfortable disclosing to people? Self-disclosure is that it's relaying personal information about yourself to other people. So think about those of you who work in customer service. Have you ever had someone come up to you and then they just relay really personal information to you, and then you kind of just stand there and you're like, oh, that's going to be 1723, thank you, all right, have a nice day, right? So there's definitely appropriate versus non-appropriate means of self-disclosure, and it depends on the person, it depends on the situation, but that's what self-disclosure is. It's revealing information about oneself. And so with the social penetration theory, we talk about different layers of self-disclosure, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about the self-disclosure factors. So what is associated with self-disclosure? First and foremost, honesty, being genuine about yourself. right? And that's not an easy thing for everyone to do. Some individuals, they don't self-disclose too much, and it could be for a number of factors. It could be based off of their upbringing, previous experiences that they had. Let's say you previously, like, you felt comfortable with certain people and they told everyone your secrets and they made you feel uncomfortable, and then after that you're like, no, 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 I don't feel comfortable disclosing personal information, because you never know what they're going to do with it. So first and foremost, it requires honesty, some genuinity to it. Second, depth, deep versus surface level. So I could say something as easily as, I like dogs. Am I self-disclosing something about myself? Yes. Is it very personal? No. And then there's that very deep surface, or not surface level information, very deep information about myself that maybe I don't share with a lot of people, and you don't share with a lot of people, because it's so deep in who you are. It's so deep in your experiences at the moment, and you're like, people don't need to know this, or maybe I shouldn't relay this information. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about depth. There's different layers to it. 3, availability of information. Can other people access this? Usually when it's deeply embedded information, like very hardcore information about yourself, usually people can't find it. When it's surface level information, like I like dogs, I teach at this place, I work at this place, usually that's easily accessible to people, and that's not very, you're not disclosing too much about yourself. Next, we have context of sharing family information with class, for instance. In some circumstances, it might be inappropriate for me to share certain things, whereas with students, it might be inappropriate for them to share certain things. Like there needs to be some sort of guideline. Whether it is in our class or other classes, you'll notice some instructors, for instance, don't disclose anything at all, because maybe they're just a little bit more straightforward, like, hey, we need to do this today, we have so much to go over, and there's just no time for that. With classes like this, and sociology, like I've taken sociology classes as well, psychology, I've found that some instructors may share some more personal information. I've even had science instructors share some personal information about themselves that related back to the course content. And so again, it depends on the context. I'm sure you've all found yourself accidentally disclosing something, and then you can feel it inside, like, okay, maybe that wasn't appropriate to tell them right now, or say at the moment, or maybe I should have just kept that to myself. So I've had those moments, and it's not a good feeling, but it definitely does depend on the context of the situation and what you feel comfortable sharing as well. Moving on, we have self-disclosure characteristics. So 1, it must contain some sort of personal information about you. 2, the sender must communicate the information verbally. So you need to tell us some sort of way. Can you do it through text? Of course you can. You can disclose information about yourself through text, but more specifically, it needs to be in some way, shape, or form out there through some means of the channel that can express like what you're trying to convey. And then 3, another person must be the target. Like I can really try my best to self-disclose myself, like to this phone, and just sit here and be like, hey, I think that you're beautiful, and I like puppies, and so on and so forth. But it's not. This is nothing. I'm not actually self-disclosing. Another person or people need to be the target. Moving on, we have different benefits and risks associated with self-disclosure. So first, let's talk about the benefits. 1, we feel good. There's that relief feeling. There's that catharsis feeling. Second, self-clarification. So if you are in a bit of a conundrum and you're like, I don't know if I'm making the right decision, and so maybe expressing that to someone else, talking about your situation, it might help clarify your beliefs. Or if you're struggling with something and you're able to go through and discuss it with another individual, it can, in a sense, be self-clarifying in that, hey, I made the right decision. Hey, I didn't make the right decision. I'm on the right path. I'm not on the right path. Next, we have self-validation. So listener agreement. So let's say they are listening to you and you do want that sense of validation. You are asking them questions like, hey, do you think that I made the right decision? Then they might be like, yeah, you did. And that's going to make you feel good. So when I talk to my mother about certain things, I'm like, what do you think? Do you think that this is the right decision? I mean, I already did it, but do you think that I made the right decision? And she'll be like, yeah. And it feels good. It goes back to that catharsis feeling. You see kind of like an overlap between these already. Or reciprocity. I always have difficulty. Reciprocity is that back and forth that we talked about with chapter 1. It goes back and forth. It needs to go back and forth with self-disclosure. If you're relaying a lot of personal information to this person and they're not relaying anything back to you, that might give you an indicator of their uncomfortableness, maybe in that situation or in that relationship. And it could honestly just be that they're not used to self-disclosing, and then that might be it. But when people tend to self-disclose, they want other people to self-disclose back, because it goes back and forth. It's like that back and forth. And then next we have impression formation. So you actually tend to become more attractive when you self-disclose to other people. Yes, I know. And then next we have relationship maintenance enhancement. So when it comes to relationship maintenance and enhancement, so self-disclosing things like, hey, I don't like it when you do A, B, and C. Hey, can we work on da, 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 da. We talk a little bit more about language, because there's a way that you can go about making it more of a conversation piece rather than attacking them, right? But it can help in solving any type of conflicts that may arise within your relationship. So letting your partner know, hey, I don't really like this, or hey, I really like this. And then it can help in enhancing your relationship with that person. And then lastly, we have moral obligations. So one of the benefits, of course, would be if there are any sexually transmitted diseases, whether you've been tested, whether you haven't been tested, giving that person the peace of mind, like, yeah, I was tested 2 months ago, and then letting you know, hey, I was tested as well. It's kind of like a moral obligation, but it can be a benefit in that you feel more comfortable with that person, and so on and so forth. Moving on, there are so many risks. I know I talked about all of the benefits and how wonderful it is, but there are also a lot of risks associated with self-disclosure, and this can also go back to why individuals don't feel comfortable self-disclosing. And remember, if you feel like, oh, this person never talks to me, they don't ever tell me personal information about themselves, it could be an indicator that they have had past experiences that have contributed to that. And so again, there's that mindfulness of, okay, they are a certain way for a reason. We all are a certain way for a reason. And how often do you really look back at that and question, like, why is this person really the way that they are? So first, one of the risks is rejection. Maybe you tell someone something and then they just completely reject you. 2, negative impression, or they reject the information. 2, we have negative impression. So maybe self-disclosing something about yourself could lead to a negative impression. So if I maybe disclose something to all of you, you may have a negative impression of me following that, may not be as motivated to like listen to the videos and so on and so forth. 3, decrease in relational satisfaction. So it can increase relational satisfaction. It kind of goes back again to the language used and how you go about having that discussion with the person. But let's say, for instance, you're at a family outing with your partner's family, and then you tell them, hey, I don't like your parents. Yeah, that might decrease your relational satisfaction with your partner, because they may not be too happy about that, especially within that type of context when you're already with them. So there's that. Loss of influence. If you're constantly self-disclosing, constantly telling the person how you feel, what you think, it can lose its influence. And that's not always the case. Maybe you and your partner, or you and your mother, you and your friends, you always self-disclose information. You feel really comfortable with them. But for some individuals, you constantly telling them, hey, like, this is how I feel, this is how I want things to be. After a while, they might just not take it as seriously as they initially did, and it might just go over their heads every time that you want to tell them something that's very important to you. Next, we have loss of control. You don't know what people will do with that bit of information, and that's the hard part. So online, for instance, this makes it a little bit more difficult, because you don't know what people are going to do with your videos, for instance, and that's why it's important to be very, very mindful of what you put on your videos. But also in your personal relationships, you just don't know what people, like, let's say you self-disclose something that's very personal about yourself, and then your friend goes and tells another friend, and then they tell another friend, or you tell a friend and then they tell your parents. And so you don't know if they're going to keep that information between you and them, even if you tell them. And I know many of us have been in circumstances like that, but you don't know if that person is going to keep their word or keep that information to themselves, or what they're going to do with it. Last but certainly not least, we have hurting the other person. like the whole situation with telling your partner, hey, I don't like your parents. And that could just be you trying to be honest with them, but also it's going to end up hurting them at the end of the day. Or I've had certain students maybe relate to me, and I'm not going to say when or where or how, but maybe they had a partner and there was maybe a physical attribute that really just stood out to them. They were like, oh, I can't stand that they do that, or I can't stand that they snore so loud when they sleep. And maybe the way that you tell them that, it can be hurtful. Like, oh, you just sleep so loud, right? And again, it goes back to the language that you use and how you express yourself to them. Because if you just come at them in that type of way, like, oh, you just always breathe so loud, you're always snoring, right? It goes back to the language, but it can also hurt their feelings quite a bit in regards to self-disclosing that to them. So moving on, here are different guidelines. You don't need to write this one down, but these are just different things to keep in mind. So is the other person important to you? Make sure that they are important to you. 2, is the risk of disclosing reasonable? 3, is the self-disclosure appropriate for the context? 4th, is the disclosure reciprocated? And then 5, will the effect be constructive? Is it going to, in a sense, benefit you in some sort of meaningful way, whether it makes you feel good or it helps you kind of resolve your problem that you may have? Just keep these questions in mind when you are thinking about self-disclosing something to someone else. And to last but certainly not least, let's talk about the social penetration theory, all right? So this is going to be the last bit for this chapter. I told you it's long, I'm sorry, but this is the last bit for social penetration theory. And it goes back to self-disclosure and different layers that we have. So social penetration theory contends that as relationships develop, content disclosed moves from shallow details to more intimate ones, building trust between the individuals and penetrating into their true personality. So we have like that exterior shell that we have where individuals in the class, for instance, they don't really know us. Here, let me share a little bit of information about myself, but they don't know the core of really who we are. They don't get to have that experience necessarily with us. They get to see that surface level information. And so when it comes to the social penetration theory, there's 5 different stages. So first, there's the orientation stage, second, the exploratory stage, third, affective stage, and then fourth, stable stage. And then after that, there could be the depenetration. So going over each one of these, the orientation stage, it's just that small talk that you have with the individual. It's the first impressions. It's not really too intimate. And so with our videos, for instance, that we uploaded this past week, we're all in the orientation stage. We're barely getting to know one another. It's that shell, it's that outside, it's that first layer that we have, like Shrek, right? Ogres are like onions. People are like onions as well. So there's that first layer of the onion that we have. Second, now we're digging a little bit deeper into the onion. We have the exploratory affirmation stage. And this is when we start revealing more about self, and then we become like somewhat casual friends. So this is like you meeting someone in class and you're like, hey, you're really cool, and then maybe you start messaging them and you add each other on a game or social media, and you start talking to each other and you reveal more about yourself. You maybe reveal more about your interests, your likes, your dislikes, your family. Now you're just casual friends. Moving on, number 3, you have the affective stage. Now this is really personal information about yourself. So it's more personal, you're using informal language, you're kind of like joking with each other, you feel comfortable with that individual, and now you have some sort of commitment to each other, like, hey, every Friday, let's go to the mall, or hey, I'll talk to you on Wednesday, yeah, like let's FaceTime. So this is when it becomes a little bit more serious, you become a little bit more involved with that individual, and you feel more connected with them in a sense, so that you feel comfortable sharing information. Next, we have the stable stage. So this is the last of the 4, and then we have depenetration. So 4, stable stage, deepest personal thoughts, predicting others' emotional reactions, and complete openness and honesty. So this is like you're at your peak of the relationship. You could just completely be 110% yourself. You, like, they know your quirks, you know their quirks, and you can just tell them honestly how you feel, and you don't necessarily have to worry too much. Because I remember, like, when you barely meet someone, whether it's a friend or a relational partner, you might keep certain things to yourself, and that would still be at like the affective stage where you're like, oh, well, I don't want to tell them that. And then with this, you might be thinking, with the stable stage, you might be like, okay, well, how should I tell them this? Because I'm gonna tell them this. And so this is when you're a lot more comfortable with that individual, and you can predict kind of their emotional reaction to certain information as well. Then lastly, we have the depenetration stage, and this is optional because some of you might be here. Some of you might be here in your relationship where it's stable, you feel comfortable with them, you feel comfortable disclosing information to them, but then there's the depenetration stage where there's a withdrawal. So maybe over time, you know, like the relationship's not working out, so there may be some more distance between the two of you, and you just stop disclosing information. And so you stop telling them how you're feeling, how you're thinking, and so on and so forth, what's going on with you. And so you start to withdraw, and then more than likely this could result in the termination of your relationship with them. So this is what the social penetration theory looks like. So there is this idea of breadth versus depth. And what we basically just went over right now is depth, right? So there's the different layers of the onion. There's that superficial layer, there's the building trust, then there's that core of who you are as an individual that a lot of people don't get to see. And then there's the breadth, which is more so related to like the topics. So for instance, my career ambitions, I can talk very surface level about my career ambitions, but I can also get very deep. So as you can tell with all of these different topics that are shown on the screen, it can be surface level information, right? But it can also dig deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the core of who I am based off of how comfortable I am with this individual. So these are just like the array of topics that you feel comfortable discussing with the individual, and the depth portion is like that comfortability, going from like superficial to, you know, like, okay, let me disclose a little bit more about that specific topic, and then let me really get at the core. So going back to our preview, in today's video, we talked about our identity, we talked about our self-concept, we talked about self-esteem, reflected appraisal, social comparison, perceive, present himself, Erving Goffman's space theory, and we also talked about self-disclosure and the social penetration theory. I know this is a lengthy chapter. I hope y'all stuck it through, because this information is very helpful in regards to your upcoming self-concept paper. But if you have any questions, comments, concerns about the chapter after reading the chapter as well, do not hesitate to reach out to me.